Good. Well, I think probably most people who are going to join us are with us. So we'll make a start. And if anybody else appears, then we can let them in. So a very warm welcome back. I was going to say welcome to anyone new who's joining us, but I don't think there's any faces I have seen that I didn't spot on that call yesterday. So welcome back to our 2025 research conference. My name is Helen Painter. I'm the founding director of the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence. Just to remind you of what Ashley said yesterday, that this is our 7th annual academic research conference, which I can hardly believe. Brandon was there at the very beginning, and Daniel was there at the very beginning as well. So yesterday we heard challenging and thoughtful and stimulating papers from Fran Porter and Chris Norden in the afternoon, and Sean Lucas and Gail Richards in the evening. And if anybody did miss any of those sessions, I do recommend you might want to take the opportunity to catch up with them once the conference videos are available in a week or two. So today we're going to have 2 further papers in this session. I'll introduce our speakers in a few minutes. And then in our second session today, we're going to be convening a panel to try to land some of the issues, or at least to begin to flesh out practicalities. As Ashley said yesterday, we're acutely aware at the CSPV that the questions we address are not just academic ones, but there are real people on the sharp end of these abuses that we're talking about. So once again, I'm going to invite us to begin our day with about 30 seconds of silence or silent prayer, if that's your tradition, so that we can honour those who have suffered and who are continuing to suffer. And finally, we are also aware that some of the people in the room may have experience of the sorts of abuses that we are talking about today. And so while it's much harder to offer good prayer and support when we're only in a virtual space, we very much want to acknowledge that that may be the case for some joining us on this call or watching the videos afterwards. And we would want to encourage you to take care of yourself as you need to during the time that we are together. Okay, we're going to move on then. So I'm going to first introduce Dr. Daniël Drost. Daniel has worked as a youth pastor, church planter with Urban Expression, and pastor in a Baptist church. He comes from a Reformed background, but then became fascinated with Anabaptist theology, and in doing so with the work of John Howard Yoder. And if I remember rightly, and I'm sure Daniel will speak to this, but he was partway through his PhD using the work of Yoder when the news about Yoder's abuses broke. Lately, Daniel's focus became more trauma-related, from trauma-sensitive theology to working with and studying trauma as a coach. So the paper he is going to be presenting to us today is entitled John Howard Yoder, Michel Foucault, and the Powers That Be. Over to you, Daniel.
Okay. The topic of this conference is the question on how to relate to the work or heritage of scandalous scholars. For my PhD research on the diaspora ecclesiology of John Howard Yoder, I extensively engaged the question on his theology and his abusive behavior and how to relate to them. When I was asked to give a lecture on this conference, I found it interesting to include Michel Foucault, another scandalous scholar. Yoder is considered to be the most important peace theologian of the 20th century, and it is difficult to address issues in the field of peace theology without referring to his work. This reference, however, became problematic when it became clear that over the course of his life, Yoder abused about 100 women for his so-called eschatological experiments. Foucault is considered to be the most important 20th century philosopher of social studies. When it became known that he had sex with minor-aged boy prostitutes in Tunisia, this was frowned upon, but it didn't create the fuss and reflection as it did with the work and legacy of John Howard Yoder. Why is this the case? In this lecture, I want to address shortly Yoder and Foucault's work, their private lives, and the question on how to deal with the legacy of their work. At the end, I will propose a change of focus from the scholars and their texts and lives to us, the readers and thinkers who engage or dismiss their work. I want to start with John Howard Yoder and Michel Foucault, a short introduction. I will start with some characteristics of both Yoder and Foucault's work. It's also the reason why I joined them together in this lecture. The first is, as I mentioned before, both their work is hard to ignore. Yoder is the main peace theologian of the 20th century. He addressed most eloquently and thorough the exegetical foundations of a biblical-based peace theology. He addressed the main arguments against nonviolence and expressed the theology and a possible communal practice for peace communities. He placed a minority ethical stand to the core of Christian theology, not as a Mennonite tendency, but as a profound Christian conviction. Foucault's work is hard to ignore when issues of power are concerned, regarding the state, in society, and at academia. His work on madness, prisons, and discipline and sexuality have shaped the discourse of psychological and sociological studies. He is the most quoted and referred scholar in this field of study. Second, once you have read their work, you cannot unread it. Once you have seen the world through their work, you cannot unsee it anymore. Nor would you want to. Two examples. Yoder's classical work, The Politics of Jesus, on nonviolence at the core of Jesus' message and ministry, offers a method and example to read the Bible in a pacifist way and to recognize the arguments against the nonviolent theology and practice. In the current situation of the NATO, who needs to stand on its own feet apart from the United States, and a call for another arms race, I cannot stop to hear his critical questions in the back of my mind. And his method on how to dismantle this arms rhetoric. Foucault's Discipline and Punish, I think his most famous book, On the Birth of Prisons, describes how prisons became institutes of self-control and self-discipline, and how this is related to self-control and self-discipline in monasteries, schools, and families, in other words, throughout society. Once you have seen society through these lenses, you cannot unsee it. I see self-disciplinary practices all around me. For example, in the almost obsessed way, we are evaluating each other. When you buy something from Vinted, when you stay for a night at an Airbnb, or whatever service or meeting is involved. Third, both scholars can be considered as mainly consistent thinkers. In Yoder's first publication, you can find the same issues and agenda as seen throughout the whole of his career. The same goes for Foucault. His Order of Discourse from 1970, his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France. This lecture describes an agenda that Foucault followed through the rest of his life, albeit in a different way than he imagined. 4. Both scholars are pretty ambiguous in their methodology, while at the same time they write extensively about it. Although it seems, for example, that Yoder follows a particular school of historiography, it's called Annales, he does not refer to this school or to their historians. He just uses their method and he calls it nonviolent. Foucault describes his method first as archaeology and later as genealogy, following the famous philosopher Nietzsche. And although he writes extensively about his methodology, as a reader, I cannot help but wonder what he is doing, what the genre is of his research. Is it history? Is it a history of ideas? Is it philosophy? Or are they sociological studies? Or what the criteria for his selections of sources are. And both scholars have been criticized on their methodology, but somehow these critics remain side notes to the compelling rhetoric of the works of Yoder and Foucault. And 5, both scholars have a history of sexual violence, as mentioned before. Right now, Yoder's work is generally considered as problematic, while Foucault's work is still extensively used. Later in this lecture, I will give an explanation of this current situation. I heard that Fran Porter yesterday argued that Yoder's work is still largely in use. Maybe we can talk about it later, but from my opinion, it's considered problematic in general. How to deal with this scandalous intellectual heritage? There are several options. The first option is to ignore the scandal. This has been done for a long time with Yoder's work until this was no longer possible. And this is still mostly the case with Foucault's work. When you take a look at recent introductions into Foucault's work, you see that most of them simply do not mention it. The second option is to stop reading Yoder and Foucault's work because it has lost its credibility. This option is also sensitive towards their victims, in that it will prevent them from running into his texts in scholarship or in the academy. But as I mentioned before, it is, however, difficult to work on ecclesiology and non-violence without referring to Yoder's oeuvre, as he is the main voice of Anabaptist theology in the 20th century. In the same way, it is difficult to refer to issues of power, especially in academic research, without referring to Foucault's work. A variation to this option, I've seen some publications in which the author works with Yoder's ideas, but he or she quotes scholars that further developed Yoder's idea without mentioning him. And then they quote, for example, Stanley Hauerwas. The third option is a quarantine of stained theology or philosophy and behavior. So the rest of their work is safe and useful. I think this was the main approach of Yoder scholars in the 90s and the beginning of this century. It is also a regular approach amongst Foucault scholars. For example, Marley Huyer, a major Foucault scholar in the Netherlands, uses this approach. We should separate his work from his personal life, from his behavior. And the fourth option is to work with Yoder's theology and Foucault's philosophy while using their work against them and showing how they failed in their own theological and philosophical commitments. So these are 4 options that you regularly will see in how to address working with scandalous scholars. One of the major questions regarding the work of scandalous scholars is the question, does their work show a justification of their behavior? Or is their work in risk of leading to violent or unhealthy practices? When you read Yoder and Foucault's work with knowledge of their personal life, you will find several ideas or concepts for which this might be the case. 2 examples. Yoder's sexuality papers, so to speak, can be regarded as a justification of his eschatological sexual experiments with women. But to mention a less obvious example, Fran mentioned this yesterday as well. Yoder's writing on reconciliation within the church, called Binding and Losing, appeared in several publications with minor variations. In his reading of Matthew 18, binding and losing meant not to only forgive, but also to enter a process of discernment. However, his insistence that the first step in the process should be a personal meeting between victim and perpetrator blocked the process, for his victims were afraid to identify themselves, and even more, to be in the same room with him. In endless discussions with discernment groups and with Marlon Miller, president of the ANBS at that time, Yoder used his intellectual brilliance and theological reasoning to justify his own position and the problematic character, in his perspective, of the attempts to enter a reconciling process without this first step. And Rachel Waldner-Crewson, who wrote an history of Yoder's abuse in 2015, shows how Yoder's use of the rule of binding and losing could delay the discernment process for years. In his case, binding and losing did not lead to reconciliation or discernment for the community. It led to one individual keeping the whole process hostage. What about Foucault? Foucault was known for his emphasis on separating his work from his person. In the Archaeology of Knowledge, he writes, "Do not ask who I am, and do not ask me to remain the same. Let us leave it to our bureaucrats and our police to see that our papers are in order." So in other words, he wants a complete separation from work and person. It is well known that Foucault did not feel free to be open about his personal life because he was a homosexual. And even in France in the 60s, this did not feel safe for him to be open about. But with our question in mind and his behavior, a very strict separation between work and life does raise eyebrows. Another example is the way he describes the case of Charles Dewey in History of Sexuality, Part 1. Dewey was a 40-year-old farm worker who played a game of masturbation with a young girl from the village. He paid her and she ran off to buy some almonds. The way Foucault describes this event and reflects on it, I find very disturbing. I quote, "What is the significant thing about this story? The pettiness of it all. The fact that this everyday occurrence in the life of village sexuality, these inconsensual bucolic pleasures could become, from certain time, the object not only of a collective intolerance, but of a judicial action, a medical intervention, a careful clinical examination, and an entire theoretical elaboration." So when I read this description of the situation, I found it very disturbing, especially with the facts of his life in the back of your mind. So in both their work, on anecdotal level and more structural, you might find these lines of thought that relativize or even justify their behavior. In my research of Yoder, I proposed, and this was a whole hermeneutic, so to speak, and I'm not going to repeat it here, but long story short, I proposed to see his work and life as one project and to engage it as such. And I tend to propose the same for Foucault's work. I formulated a methodology on how to engage Yoder's work and take the good and the evil in his work and in his life both seriously. I was fascinated by the difference in reception of the scandalous behavior in Yoder and Foucault's life and the consequences for their status as major scholars in their fields. As I mentioned before, I thought, at least, that Yoder's work is mostly cancelled, while Foucault's work is still widely used. I think this has to do with three issues. I think there's a more direct line between Yoder's work and his behavior, especially in how he sinned against everything his theology stands for. And this is less the case with Foucault. Second, I think Yoder's work sketches positive outlines for a Jesus-like, non-violent community life. If his own community life and behavior contradicts this, we find this very disturbing. For Foucault, this is less the case. He doesn't sketch any positive outlines. He structurally dismantles power dynamics in society and academia. So Yoder sketches positive outlines and Foucault only negative ones. And I think that might be a major factor. And the last one is that Yoder represented a particular community, the Mennonite Church and academia. So there was a particular community that felt a need to reflect on their relation to Yoder, his behavior, and their own engagement to the whole situation. And for Foucault, this is less the case. One of my major problems with Yoder's work are his ideological tendencies. Ideals can unite and inspire, but they are also a risk of leading to limitless and unsafe behavior, especially when these ideas are religiously motivated. For my PhD research and since, I developed a critical attitude towards ideological tendencies in the theologies and the philosophies I engage. Since 2019, however, when I defended my research, I feel the risk of another ideological tendency, which is that of the reader. My proposal today is to make a move from the text, which is the scholar and his scandalous behavior, to the reader, us. Since 2019, I noticed the development of a new purity in our society, which is visible, for example, in the development of a cancel culture. And some of the characteristics of this new purity, as I see them, are a very black and white approach. Someone is either good or evil, and there's less room for shades of gray. If someone is good, he can be trusted, and what he claims to be true must be true. If someone is bad, he cannot be trusted and should be cancelled. He is not worthy of our time. Also, the concept of contamination. The idea of association with someone evil is considered problematic as such. And in other words, there's a strong distinction between the text or the scholar, the scandalous scholar, and the reader, in which the reader stays morally pure and has the obligation out there to make a distinction between good and evil. I want to describe two possible corrections to this new purity and show an old way forward. The first correction is towards our tendency to search for gurus. Stine Jensen, she's a Dutch philosopher, published a book called Gurus. It's in Dutch, but she described how she joined a yoga retreat in France. A famous yoga guru would be present and she was interested. The retreat consisted out of a lot of meditation, teaching, and yoga, but also food and sleep deprivation. And after a couple of days, they were given cookies with an hallucinatory substance. She got into a bad trip and she left the retreat. In this book, she researched herself and her attitude towards what happened. She considered herself to be a very rational person, but she felt the urge to surrender to a guru. And in doing so, let go of basic food and sleep routines. She was handed these drugs without knowledge or permission. And this shocked her. But even more, she found it disappointing how other yoga practitioners, her kind of people, would defend the guru, and in doing so, relativized her very experience. And what I find helpful is how she reflects on her and our need to find gurus and to surrender to them. Surrender to someone who knows the truth, knows what is right and knows what is wrong. And even if we are smart and independent people, but in doing so, we raise them high and move away from our own sense of discernment. If they fail, and they always will, we are left with a sense of betrayal. And our sense of betrayal towards some of the scholars we discussed today might have to do with our tendency to make them gurus. For me, at least this was the case with Yoder. So this is the first correction we might need for our tendency to search for gurus. Our second correction concerns our tendency to idealize victimhood. I recently reread some of René Girard's work. I do not have the time to give a fair description of his ideas here, but to make it short, he describes how in post-Christian societies we suffer from a kind of disguised way of scapegoating. And he states that the post-Christian society becomes entangled in a competition to discern who the biggest victim is. And here we see victimhood as morally superior. Choosing the side of the victim is keeping your hands clean and making sure you stand on the right side of history. And to make myself clear, I'm not talking about Yoder as a scapegoat or his victims as victims. Maybe you know that Yoder could refer to himself as a scapegoat, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about us as readers and our urge to stay morally pure. As Girard puts it, the care for victims has become a paradoxical stake of mimetic rivalries, of competing impulses. There are victims in general, but the most interesting are always those who make us condemn our fellow human beings. So I described two tendencies I noticed in society and I noticed in myself: an urge to search for gurus and an urge to morally idealize victimhood. And I think in both urges, we tend to move away from ourselves. So how can we relate to scandalous scholars and their work and bring ourselves fully into the process? I want to finish this lecture with Martin Buber's concept of I and thou. Because this addresses our question in a helpful way, I think. Martin Buber is a scholar of Jewish spirituality, and he wrote Ich und du, the German title, in the 20s. It can be considered a critique of modern objectification of people in social relationships. And he argues there are two basic attitudes in life. The first one is I and it, in which we use or objectify the other. We do not really engage the other. And the second basic attitude in life is I and thou, in the old translation, I and you. Here we do engage the other, and in doing so, we are changed. The first attitude is safe. The second attitude makes us fully human. I think that our tendencies to find gurus and idealize victimhood are examples of the first attitude, in which we move away from ourselves and stay untouched. As I mentioned, this can feel unsafe, or this can feel safe. But what if we apply an I and you attitude towards scandalous scholars and their work? We engage their work and we have to deal with the discomfort this brings. We have to digest it. This is the hard and slow epistemological process, I think the same process as we use in reading the Bible. And this is the hard and slow epistemological process in which their work might trigger our own pain. But it will make us fully human. So, to summarize, in this lecture, I changed the perspective from the lives and work of scandalous scholars to us, the readers. Not to avoid the difficult questions on the scholars, but to address our attitude as readers. I described the tendency in me and our society, which I called a new purity. I mentioned two movements away from ourselves, the urge to find gurus and the urge to idealize victimhood. And I closed with Martin Buber's I and you as a way to engage the texts as the persons we are. I realized in writing this lecture that I'm influenced by my work as coach in the last couple of years. When people suffer from trauma, it might be helpful to start with the things outside oneself, the perpetrator, the circumstances. But healing lies in the way inwards. I realize I propose the same way inwards in this lecture, and I hope this is healing as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Lots and lots to think about there, and really important points of both contact and disagreement with Fran's paper yesterday. So really helpful. I'm pretty confident there's going to be lots of engagement from the room. So let me see what who would like to suggest something. Suggest something, you know what I'm trying to say. Well, I can. Oh, is that somebody? Okay. Well, I can start. Do you think it makes a difference that you speak about John Howard Yoder being part of a community and Foucault lacking that and that making a difference to the way that their work's received? What about the fact that Yoder is explicitly, and you also point out the fact that Yoder is kind of offering a positive vision, whereas Foucault is kind of it's more about critique. The other issue, and forgive me if you mentioned this, like you probably did, and I didn't notice, although I was taking lots of notes. Obviously, Yoder is speaking explicitly from a Christian perspective, and Foucault most certainly isn't. To what extent do you think that makes a difference to the way that we, or weighs into the difference to the way that we perceive and should treat their work?
Yeah, I think that's also the question about community, because when you talk about Christian scholars, if you are a Christian scholar or a Christian yourself, somehow he's part of your community and you have to relate to them. And this is less the case, of course, with Foucault or other philosophers who are not Christian. And it's so I think, yeah, so Christian scholars are in that sense part of your community when you're Christian. And then you need to do your homework. I can imagine you feel more urge to do your homework or to deny it, which is also a way to deal with it. But yeah. And I think the particular thing of Yoder is that he was really, he was sort of the main theologian for one specific denomination. But he was also larger than that. So this denomination who was sort of, who always saw themselves as a minority, now they had a major theological voice. And that's, I think, also one of the reasons why the Mennonite community was hesitant to really put pressure on it. Yeah.
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 Others. John. Oh, sorry, I should Fran as well, but let's go John first.
I think Fran was before me, so I'm happy to defer to
Sorry,
Fran.
I didn't see who.
Yeah, I mean, just the proposition, I suppose, about the difference between Foucault and Yoder. I think a lot of it is about audience and their research communities. And I'm going to introduce a really unhelpful distinction here, which I don't really kind of agree with, but it might help us get to something here, which is that between personal and political ethics. There's not really a distinction there, but so in the context of a Mennonite and wider Christian community, personal ethics, personal piety, personal sexual ethics are going to be especially important, I think. And when that comes out, there will quite rightly be, deep concern. And I kind of follow you, Daniel, in your judgment that there's been a fairly extensive cancelling of John Howard Yoder. And as I mentioned in Fran's seminar yesterday, I'm probably one of the few people to use his work substantially in the last couple of years in a publication. And I did that alive to the fact of the problems with it. But I think you're generally right about that. On the Foucault side, I think, and in secular academia, which is mainly where I work at a UK university, political ethics are the things that are going to get you cancelled. So if you've taken money from the CIA or you've been pro-Israeli or something, you're going to get into trouble. If you are convicted of sexual offences, possibly less so. That might seem odd, but I think that's been my experience in the secular academy, and there's lots of examples of that. And I think there are interesting reasons why that might be the case, which I won't go any further on. It'd be interesting to see whether you think that kind of distinction about audience and the general audience for their research could matter. My other question was really, can you be a little more explicit? I asked this question essentially to Fran yesterday, and it was a bit difficult, and so I'm going to ask it to you too, about the kind of uses of Yoder, because for me, for the reasons you gave, if you're working on ecclesiology, if you're working on peace and war questions, certainly from within kind of free church traditions, it's pretty much impossible not to engage Yoder. But I don't think we should be headlining him. I completely agree with your statements about the danger of gurus and heroes, and I think that's obvious that we must avoid that. But are there kind of better ways of engaging? And if I might be a little bit, and I'll stop in a moment, but a little specific, there is one book which was published 3 or 4 years ago, which I think is a spectacularly good use of Yoder, but which I don't think is being cited and used as much as it could be, partly because it is using Yoder, which is Kyle Gingerich Hebert's The Architectonics of Hope, which is a PhD project which would have been begun before the Yoder scandal came out. Now, it seems to me that is a good usage, but it is also...
Could you put the title in the chat, maybe?
Sorry?
Could you put the title in the chat?
Sure, I'll do that now, and I'll also stop. So I spoke for too long, but a couple of big things. One is, what do you recommend we do? And do you think a kind of audience difference of the type I suggested is important here?
Yeah, so thanks for your question. So I really, for me, it was a very existential struggle how to deal with this work, because for me, I really like the way he approached theology, his focus on following Jesus, discipleship. So for me, it was really an example of how to do theology. And when I heard the news about his life and his abuse of women, I was very, I felt like one of my heroes fell, so to speak. And I really had a question. I think maybe the same question that Fran elaborated on yesterday. How does this relate to his theology? And does his theology show tendencies which lead to this behavior? And in the end, my conclusion was that, so first of all, I considered his sexuality papers as the same as his regular work. So I read it and I thought it's the same approach, the same method. So actually it should be part of his main corpus, so to speak. And then I thought, so what is going on? Why? And in the end, I found it very problematic so what I described to be the idealistic tendencies of his work. And I also did some research on communities that worked with Yoder's discipleship theology, for example, urban expression. And I, for myself, was also part of an urban expression project. And we were suffering from these ideological tendencies, so to speak. We moved into a poor neighborhood with 3 families. We tried to follow the way of Christ, and we were always tired. We were always worn out, so to speak, and was very difficult to address the issue. And I could relate that to Yoder's work. And I thought, yeah, so this idealistic tendencies, it's the same that I am in urban expression project getting worn out, or that you in the end use violence against women. It's the same idealistic tendencies that make you move away from yourself and from your own borders and your own discernment and your own care. So I've been teaching on Yoder quite a lot, but lately I've always mentioned that I find this problematic. So the idealistic tendencies and his abuse of women is a fruit of this tendency, so to speak. And that's how I engage it. So the whole package and the problematic parts. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Fran to come in, although I'd love to put a pin in that and say I'd like you to explain that more. But let's hear Fran's question.
Oh, there's so many things. I mean, thank you, Daniel. What strikes me in one way is your approach. I really like that you have said that this is about us. Because I think sometimes I have come across when raising this, the objection, why should we be given time to this man dealing with the Mennonite in question, resenting that he is dominating our conversation and so on. And yes, it is a bit about him, but it's actually very much about us. Yes, how we respond to him, but just generally how this was enabled to happen in the first place. And we don't have to be part of the Mennonite church to know that there could be similar dynamics where we are. So I think owning, and maybe that in itself is a kind of counter to a cancel culture, which is that it's not just about them, it's about us. And who are we? How do we do theology? And why? And not thinking that this couldn't happen in different ways. Again, different context, different subject, who knows, or different emerging issue, but nevertheless. So I very much like that approach. I did have a question. I think if before I can get to that, the thing about whether it's still being advocated or not, I think probably now the tendency maybe is just to drop, but I think just dropping is a problem because it's not being dropped with, and this is the reason why. It's just being kind of, my sense is, I mean, I don't know because I haven't researched what every course is doing and so on, but my sense is that maybe that is what will be happening, that he will just be dropped, and therefore everything that happened and all the issues around it are just not dealt with, and possibly that, for understandable reasons, but I think unsatisfactory reasons, is maybe what's happening. I think in print, if you were to go and look for things in print, if you wanted to take a informed position on this, what are people saying, you would still find the majority in support in terms of rationalizations and reasons, because people who aren't supporting aren't writing. So that's partly why I think I said in my paper, the majority voice, or is it the loudest voice that seemed to emerge from the early 2000s, 2015, particularly 2015, for the first 5 years were very much, and the few years before 2015, for those who did know, because they were closer. They didn't talk about it too much, but as things, well, actually, things first emerged in 1992, and I mean, most of us had no idea. I mean, it's most extraordinary, and that's a whole other subject about what wasn't said and to who it wasn't said, so that we would know. But that, you know, so. But I'm also finding people who are students, usually international, who have absolutely no idea. This news has not filtered through to them, and they come with Yoder as a core part of their ideas. And this is really new. And some are receptive, and some we will have to wait and see. But I also do know of academics who advocate because they like his theology, but really are not interested in the other stuff. So unlike yourself and John, who would have to deal with that as you deal with his theology. So, I mean, that may not be that common, but I have come across it, and so on. But what piqued, well, one of the many things in terms of question is about Foucault, and again, to be quite honest, until I knew what you were presenting on, I this is something that I had missed. I had to do some Googling to find out, so again, this was completely new to me. I mean, again, I haven't used him particularly in my research and not read directly. For all I know, some of the people I've read have been influenced by him, but he's not been a major figure, so that maybe is why. But the idea that there's a different reception because there's less of a direct line with his philosophy, his thinking, and his behavior, I find quite strange, given power was his central motif, and sexual violence, even with supposedly consenting prostitutes, is an instance of power relation. So it's strange, but whether that's not so much to do with him as it is to do with the people using his work, who don't perceive of sexual violence as being fundamentally about power, which was one of the points I was making yesterday. And that could be therefore also about us not seeing that this was fundamentally an issue of power, and somebody with power and people with in relative little power, let alone the age difference and the exploitation of that, which is all part of it. So that is something that struck me as strange. I don't really have any comment on that. On the fact that
yeah. It also has to do with the way he describes power. So he describes power as mainly something we do to ourselves. So we are controlling ourselves all the time. Our whole society is a way of self-control and self-confession.
That's convenient for him, isn't it? It removes his responsibility to act towards other people. I mean, there's a huge flaw in that. I mean, I would say, yeah.
Yeah. And so I was struggling with it actually, because he writes a lot about, for example, he writes extensively about the Greek preference for young boys. And when you have his life in, knowledge of his life, and you're looking for, how is he describing it? What is going on? What is happening here? And
there's quite a parallel there with Yoder and his explanation of what single women needed.
Yeah.
And speaking for and assumptions.
Yeah, except that, he was, so I didn't find very, so someone said, I forgot her name, but the typical Mennonite obsession of male leaders with feminine sexuality, you know. I don't see that with Foucault, and maybe because he was homosexual, but he's not really into the business of telling women what to do or what to say. So in that sense, he has a different agenda than Yoder did. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions? Can I ask Daniel and Fran about, because I think you both touched on this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about not quite the guilt by association, but the idea of using the work of those who use their work. And in some senses, I guess there's an element of unavoidability when you've got figures that are so enormous in the field that you cannot, like you said, Daniel, you cannot unhear things that have been heard. You cannot pretend that these men did not write. And I'm thinking about the field of medical ethics, you know, the sorts of appalling things that were done in the concentration camps, but actually the knowledge that was gained, we can never unknow as a human race. So what do we do with the work of those who have used the work of Yoder and Foucault, especially if they have chosen, if they've done so in the knowledge of what has happened and have done it so uncritically?
Yeah, so I totally agree with one of Fran's remarks that she said, if you just drop it, you do not engage the whole situation. So you can work with Yoder's ideas without his scandalous life, but then you miss the point. And so I have, to make it a bit more personal, I have a Reformed background. And when I got interested into Anabaptist theology, my Reformed friends, they started making jokes about Münster, you know, the naked Anabaptists and stuff like that. So when something happened what happened with what Yoder did, and when it came out, a lot of Reformed theologians thought, yeah, you know, that's always the case with Anabaptists in the 16th century, in the 19th century, in the 20th century. So, and they will always say, discipleship, you know, if you raise the stakes too high for discipleship, you will get sexual violence. And although I start to recognize that this is often the case, I also find it very disappointing, because I was looking for a theology in which following Jesus was central, instead of only, you know, like the forgiving of sins, but also a new life. And so the whole, when you talk about discipleship with Yoder, you should also talk about the violence that comes in its trail. And that's why I think just using his ideas without this troublesome, this troubled background, I think you're missing the point. So I think it should be out there, I think. I don't know what you think, Fran.
But it feels that it's for the scholars who do that to give account for themselves, not that I'm suggesting that they've done anything wrong, because for much of the time, or most of the time, their work was done that they didn't know. I mean, again, it's what is in the ideas. And I think having with some colleagues recently done a read through, for me, I think it was probably a first reading, but for them it was a second reading of The Politics of Jesus. Now, we're 50 years on, so of course things have changed and the way people write has changed and styles have changed and all the rest of it. But it's still quite extraordinary that what you read there is very much a white male American take on the world. And it's very striking now when he writes, for example, about you know, state violence and citizens have no need to fear the police. And you kind of thinking, reading that again, the context of the most recent kind of Black Lives Matters protests. But he was writing and putting all this together, and there was civil rights in America. I mean, it's just a complete sort of block. And but then he was quite anti-liberationist because he associated it with violence and all the rest of it, and critiqued it for that without seeing that the other things that it was actually talking about. So where am I going in answer to that is it is so actually even his stuff that is considered not involved needs rethinking. He has a couple of very clearly misogynistic statements that are out in public print. And maybe we didn't see them or they weren't seen when they were first read. I'm thinking of right at the end of his life. So much for repentance, for his abuse. When he misrepresents feminism and is sarcastic towards it in a lecture he gave revisiting the politics of Jesus. And in his published posthumously, but his capital punishment writings, which really are a shock when you actually read that his section, what he does with Girard and makes himself to be the the scapegoat, sorry, of women. Talk about a plea for his innocence, and it's extraordinary. But I don't
That's
think
why I found it. That's why I found it difficult to mention Girard because he also
yeah.
misuses it. But yeah,
But I
yeah.
mean, Girard again has been critiqued by the late Grace Jansen, a feminist philosopher, for basically Girard's fundamental stand that we desire out of our lack, that the human beings lack and they desire, and and whereas saying, well, doesn't God not give out of abundance? Can desire not come out of abundance to share, and not just because you want what somebody else has? Sorry, it's a very you know curtailed argument. So I mean a lot. I mean, obviously I have drawn on feminist thinking throughout my uh, life, and I find an awful lot uh, that feminists have been saying for decades suddenly appearing as ideas in the mainstream. That is not to say that feminist work is without need of critique. I'm not suggesting that at all, but I think, um, you know, how do we engage? And the examples I was giving yesterday, Daniel, were two texts that were produced. I mean, I make reference to Yoder's work in a book that was published in 2015. It actually went to bed in the publishers, as it were, out of my hands in 2013, and it took 15 months to come out and see the light of day, by which time, and I really, all I had heard was something very minor around flirtatious and possibly extramarital affairs and stuff. And it was not, and it was very obscure. And I couldn't find any more. This was verbal years earlier, and it had gone from my kind of purview at that stage. And I was recommended by this to use Yoda for what I was writing by somebody I trusted, and they must have known. And again, this keeping counsel is interesting. There's a whole other subject, but the two texts I referred to, Daniel, they did know. They knew plenty because they were insiders and they hadn't had Rachel Waltner Goossen's report, but they knew enough. Uh, and um, and yet still, and they try and they do take it seriously. I'm not suggesting they don't, but they don't let it interfere largely, a little bit, but largely in using his work. And I think it's such hard work to do that? I mean, how would you go through Stanley Hauerhaus's work and trace but I think it's up for us to look at the very ideas themselves.
No, I found it very, when I watched your lecture from yesterday, I thought you yourself are giving an example how to deal with Yoder's work. You know, you have read some stuff before you know what happened, of how he was a sexual predator, and now you reread his work with that in mind, and you give reflections on it to us. So I think you are actually showing a very helpful way in dealing with Yoder's work. And what I really cannot mention enough, I think his work, all of his work, and his behavior are one thing. So we should approach it as one thing. And I think you're doing that. So yeah.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question before we take a short break. Ashley, you've had your hand up for a while.
Daniel, thank you for your paper. Really helpful. And I risk asking this question as a fairly profound non-specialist. Ethics isn't my field. I don't enjoy reading it very much, to be honest. But we were reading as a CSBV postgrad research group. We were reading together a book that had been edited on Yoder's positions on capital punishment. And in fact, you came and joined us, I think, as we finished that book to talk a little bit. And I had only known Yoder as a name, didn't know anything about the controversy. And I remember as I read this book, and I'm hardly pro-death penalty, not at all, but I remember reading and feeling like he was saying, the death penalty is bad, not really out of a Christian argument, but because punishing someone for something they've done is really just a reflection of a mean society. I am sure I am oversimplifying it. But when I then had someone mention, well, you know, he's got all this scandal and all this wrongdoing, I guess my question is, do you think these people intentionally write in ways that, you know, if anyone ever finds out, I'll have already kind of constructed an argument that supports it? Do you think being involved in harm of others sort of inherently pushes us towards kind of denying the importance of accountability and repercussions? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's inherently the case for perpetrators in general, but I think you have a very fair description of this last version of his book on capital punishment, because I think there were 3 versions or something like that, but in the end you feel like he is saying that punishment is primitive, yeah? A sort of primitive form of, but when he was writing this version, he had been, I think, for at least 10 years in all these discernment groups trying to avoid punishment. So then it comes back in his theological reflection. Yeah, so I think you had a very fair point with this basic intuition that, yeah, he's moving away from punishment. Yeah.
And points a similarity with Foucault, who makes not unrelated points, I think, in his work, as I read.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. You've given us lots to think about. Thank you for the dialogue, for those who joined in, particularly you, Fran. Really appreciate hearing the two of you talk about this as well. And no doubt there'll be things we're wanting to pick up this evening. We're going to take let's express our appreciation. Thank you very much. We're going to take a 10-minute comfort break. Those of you who are certainly the south of England will be glad of a comfort break. I'm sure others will as well. So I make it 7 minutes past. So we'll come back at what did I say? So we'll come back in 10 minutes. Is that okay? 17 minutes past by my watch. Thank you.